Yeah, family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
We have another person, David Friedrich Strauss, who lived from 1808 to 1874. Interesting, because Strauss, as part of this whole skepticism of the Enlightenment, is going to start looking at the Synoptic Gospels. Which are the Synoptic Gospels? Would that be John? No, Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he's going to start seeing the discrepancies in the Synoptic Gospels. You mean these three Gospels are not all the same? No. He's going to start taking a look at the differences in all those Gospels. Whoa, how is it that the Gospel of Mark doesn't talk about Jesus' birth? The Gospel of Matthew talks about Jesus' birth. And the Gospel of Luke gives us a whole different story of Jesus' birth. What do you do with that? Now that we have skeptics as a result of the Enlightenment, you know, the Bible is becoming more accessible to all. Remember how it was that with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, suddenly it wasn't Father Jamie with the only Bible in the room. We could print a Bible, so if anyone in this room wanted a Bible, we could get you a Bible in your hands. You could start reading and saying, wait a minute, I thought I read something different. There's something different in Matthew from Luke. So Strauss started pointing to the discrepancies in the Synoptic Gospels. His conclusion were that the Gospels are not a book of history, but are faith stories. It's ultimately the story of this Christ of the faith. As a result of the faith that these people have, how are they interpreting Jesus? Strauss was influenced by Hegel. So stepping back, what did Hegel believe? Hegel believed that the mind worked by formulating a thesis, and then an antithesis, and then somewhere in the middle it'll arrive at a synthesis. Interesting. Sort of with this, for instance, the thesis, we might start off as a, as a young person believing everything that we're told, having lots of faith. You know, and you believe all sorts of stories about pink unicorns or whatever it is that you come to believe. But then, wait a minute, you start learning, and you become more skeptical, right? And eventually you come to some medium between the two of those. Isn't that what Hegel is trying to say? We move from the thesis to the antithesis, the opposite, and then often what happens is we end up somewhere in the middle with what Hegel referred to as a synthesis. So Hegel believed that's how the mind works. So Strauss's thesis was simply this, that the Orthodox or conservative believe that God reveals God's self in history. People like Catholics tend to believe that God reveals God's self in history. The opposite extreme, what's the opposite extreme? Rationalists of the Enlightenment, what do they believe? That there's no revealed religious truth. And so, on the one hand, one extreme, God reveals religion. The other one, there is no revealed religion. And so what's the synthesis? How it is that, well, let's take a look at how it is that these Gospels, what are they really? They are myths expressing universal truths. They express universal truths, but let's come to this happy medium between the Catholics, the Christians, and the atheists. An example that he used was how it is that the creation story is a myth containing religious truths and filled with symbols, but not rooted in historical events. There were not just two people in a garden at the beginning of time, where God opened up the stomach of one and took out a rib and put it in, and made it into a human person. Right? I mean, we've heard these biblical stories. That's not historically what happened, but instead that these are stories that have universal truths. How it is that human beings were trying to make sense of the world, and so they came up with these stories to try to explain where we came from. And so, therefore, the question for him is this Christ of faith rooted in the Jesus of history? What conclusion would he come to? Not at all, right? This Christ that you all believe in, how that is, that's rooted in the Jesus of history? I don't see it. He came up with the expression that the gospel is a pearl necklace of myths strung together. Wouldn't it be a great exam question for this course to be able to rebut that, right? If David Friedrich Strauss came in and said the gospel is a pearl necklace of myths strung together, how would you respond to that? What do you say to a person who says that? Strauss's conclusions then, what conclusions did he draw in his life? He said that yes, there are some truths in the gospel. For instance, that his conclusion, like Remar's came to certain conclusions. Strauss came to certain conclusions, for instance, that Jesus was this supreme mystic. He had this vision of God, this idea of God that not a lot of people of his time had. He called God Father. That was pretty radical. So he was this mystic and an exemplar of our relationship with God. He talked about loving God and loving neighbor. It seems that he's an example for us to be able to follow. Wait a minute, are we sensing a high Christology or a low Christology? Strauss is obviously a low Christology. Jesus, or as Father Donald Buggart would call him, Saint Jesus, because in this, a low Christology is essentially a Saint Jesus Christology. What do we mean by that? Is a saint God? Saints are humans like us. Saint Monica, Saint Rose, Saint Julia, Saint George, Saint Edward, whatever saint you're talking about, they were humans like us. Do we believe that Jesus was a human like us and just became a saint at the end of his life? No. Which is why a low Christology is no Christology at all. There is not a lot of history in the Gospels, was his conclusion. That the Gospels are not a book of history. It's a book of these, based on these people's belief of who Jesus was. There was no resurrection. Interesting. He was denying, because once Jesus was born and Jesus died, but like the rest of us, right? We bury our loved ones, and do they come back in 3 days? They don't. I mean, it's just part of our experience as human beings that resurrection is not part of our experience. And that after the resurrection then, various, what he called liberal histories arose. Like the Gospel of Mark, right? Stories arose of what it was that Jesus did. Casting demons into swine, or doing whatever else it is that in these Gospels. Okay, various stories arose. Or Q. Who is Q? Liberal histories arose like Mark or Q. Q was that source that we believe influenced whom? Matthew and Luke, right? Q is was the German initial for the word Kel, which means source, right? There's some source that influenced Matthew and Luke, because there are stories that Matthew and Luke have that are not in Mark, so they must have come from some source, and that source we refer to as Q. We've never found that source. It would be great discovery if we discovered it. We've never discovered it, so we just call it Q. So that was Strauss. The questions that would arise then as we read Strauss is, who is Jesus? If you read Strauss, then what conclusion are you going to come to in terms of Jesus? Is Jesus different from us as human beings in terms of kind? Is he something other than human? Or is he just different in degree, meaning he's holier than us? He's simply saying Jesus. What conclusion can we come to as Christians? Is Jesus just different in degree, saying Jesus? Doesn't seem that that's acceptable. It seems that Jesus has to be different in kind from human beings. He has to be different from us. Conservatives reacted against Strauss's mythological interpretation and against Bruno Bauer's denial of the historical Jesus. Do you remember the name Bruno Bauer? Who is he? An atheist. Wow. So suddenly, we as Christians and as Catholics have to defend our faith. In our course on the theology of the diaconate and the priesthood, we referred to this as the time of the fortress church, which simply meant what? We as a church were on the defense. People were coming and attacking our ideas, which meant what? How do we defend ourselves? Liberals would say that Jesus is not God by nature, but is the fullest instance of graced humanity. So we have how it is that Strauss really created a reaction. Strauss and Bruno Bauer, these people, by raising questions, they really ruffled some feathers in the church and in theological circles, as you can imagine. When you start saying, for instance, that Jesus was simply a great ethical teacher who taught the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood and sisterhood of all humanity and the dignity of the human soul, okay, that's great, but I don't go to church on Sunday to worship that type of Jesus. That's a very low Christology.